Christmas, 1895. In the mountains of North Carolina, in the middle of a dark forest, the lights of hundreds of windows suddenly flare up. This is not just a house. It is the largest private mansion in the history of the United States. The entire story of America's largest mansion, Biltmore. 150 rooms, its own power plant, a winter garden the size of a city park. But behind this fairy tale are bills piling up like an avalanche of snow, and a life slowly being eaten away by its own palace. Beneath the marble staircase are narrow servant corridors, scorching boiler rooms, a kitchen that works almost around the clock. Dozens of people live here, people you won't find in any guidebook. Wars, inflation, the Great Depression will come and go. Vanderbilt's heirs will sell land, paintings, forests, just to keep this stone giant from collapsing. And at some point, two women in the family will make a decision that changes everything. They will turn a private palace into a tourism machine for survival. Today, we'll step behind the postcard facade and ask, what is the true price of the dream called Biltmore? And who paid for it to still be standing? If you enjoy deep investigations into Gilded Age architecture and the families who built it, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which house to explore next. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. Chapter 1. A young man with too much money and a mountain view. The story begins not with stone or mortar, but with silence. George Washington. Vanderbilt II was the youngest son of one of America's richest families. He inherited a vast fortune. He spoke 8 languages. He collected books the way other men collected horses. At the same time, he was quiet, shy in company, uneasy under the spotlight that followed the Vanderbilt name wherever he went. In 1888, at 26 years old, he came to Asheville, North Carolina. Officially, he came for his health. The mountain air was said to cure weak lungs and lingering coughs. Unofficially, he may have come to escape. Escape New York society. Escape the constant comparisons to his louder, more confident brothers. Escape the weight of a fortune he had never chosen, but could never put down. He stood on a bare hilltop outside town and looked at the Blue Ridge Mountains stretching into the distance. The land below was cheap. The view above felt endless. Somewhere in that quiet moment, as wind moved through the grass, a decision began to take shape. He would build a house, not a cottage, not a seasonal retreat in the fashionable sense, a house that would prove something. To whom exactly remains unclear. Perhaps to his family, perhaps to himself, perhaps to no one in particular, except the man who had to live inside it. George began buying land, first a few hundred acres, then a few thousand, then more. Deeds and parcels slowly stitched together into a single vast estate. Eventually, the property would cover 125,000 acres, nearly 200 square miles of forest, fields, and mountains, larger than many American cities and still growing. The house itself would follow the same logic of excess. George hired Richard Morris Hunt, the most famous architect in America at the time. Hunt had designed mansions for the Astors and the Belmonts. He had studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. He knew how to turn money into palaces. And that, essentially, is what George quietly asked him to do. Hunt drew inspiration from the great chateau of France's Loire Valley, towers and turrets, steep slate roofs, limestone walls 4 feet thick in places. The house would eventually contain 250 rooms, 4 acres of floor space under a single roof, a banquet hall with a 70-foot ceiling, a library designed to hold 23,000 books. This was not just architecture. This was ambition made visible. But building such a house in the wilderness created problems that no Parisian chateau had ever faced. There were no railroads close enough, no quarries on site, no brickyards, no lumber mills capable of producing the quantities needed. To raise his private palace, George first had to build the world that could build it. A private rail spur connected the construction site to the main line. A brick kiln rose on the property. A woodworking shop, a stone-cutting yard, infrastructure before ornament. At the peak of construction, more than 1,000 workers labored on the estate. Stonemasons, carpenters, plasterers, electricians, landscape crews, skilled hands from across the region. The work went on for 6 years, season after season, as walls climbed higher and scaffolds crept along the facades. Frederick Law Olmsted, the designer of New York's Central Park, was brought in to transform the raw mountain land into something that resembled an English country estate. He ordered the planting of hundreds of thousands of trees. He laid out miles of winding approach roads that would slowly reveal the house. Instead of showing it all at once, he designed gardens, orchards, and a working farm meant to supply the house with food and keep the estate productive. Not just picturesque. The scale was staggering. The costs were just as overwhelming. Exact figures were never made public, but most estimates suggest George spent somewhere between $4 and $6 million on the house and grounds. In today's terms, that would mean well over $100 million for a single home and its landscape. And yet, for all the money and all the planning, one question remained unanswered. Why? Why build something so large in a place so remote? Why pour a fortune into a house that for years would be seen by almost no one outside family and guests? George never explained. He left no detailed journals laying out his motivations, no long letters that reveal his inner calculations. What is known is this: he wanted beauty, he wanted books, he wanted gardens and forests managed scientifically, not stripped bare for quick profit. He wanted a place where he could live quietly, surrounded by the things he valued, rather than the expectations of others. Whether he understood the burden he was creating is another matter. The house was not yet finished, and already it required an army to maintain. Chapter 2: The Army Behind the Dream. The house required an army to maintain. George was about to hire one. By 1895, as the mansion neared completion, the question was no longer how to build Biltmore. The real question had shifted to something more complicated: how to operate it. A structure this size did not simply sit empty between visits. It breathed. It aged. It consumed resources. It demanded constant, invisible attention. George began assembling a staff. The exact number varies depending on the source, but at its peak, the household employed somewhere between 60 and 80 servants. Some accounts suggest the number climbed even higher during special events and holiday seasons. These were not occasional day workers. Most lived on the property year-round, their lives woven into the daily rhythm of the estate. The hierarchy was rigid and carefully maintained. At the top stood the estate superintendent, responsible for the entire property. Below him, a house steward oversaw everything that happened inside the mansion. Then came the butler, who controlled the dining room, the wine, and the front-of-house staff. The housekeeper managed the maids, guarded the linens and cleaning supplies, and quietly controlled access to the most private corners of domestic life. Beneath them, the structure branched into specializations that sound almost medieval to modern ears. There were footmen who served meals, answered doors, and moved like shadows through the corridors. Ladies' maids dressed the female guests and maintained their wardrobes. Valets did the same for the men, laying out clothes and tracking every pair of gloves and shoes. A head chef commanded a kitchen brigade that included multiple cooks, scullery maids, and a dedicated pastry specialist. Laundresses worked in steam-filled rooms in the basement, scrubbing and boiling linens by hand before electric machines became standard. Outside the mansion, the staff multiplied further. Gardeners maintained the formal landscapes, greenhouses, and flower beds. Foresters managed the vast woodlands. Dairymen ran the estate's working farm, supplying milk, butter, and cream. Grooms cared for the horses. Coachmen drove the carriages along the long, winding drives. Later, as automobiles arrived, chauffeurs took their place behind the wheel. Each role came with its own uniform, its own schedule, and its own narrow strip of responsibility. The estate functioned like a small town, largely self-sufficient. The farm produced vegetables, fruit, poultry, and pork. The dairy churned butter and bottled milk. The wood shops crafted furniture, repaired doors, and built whatever the house required. A blacksmith shoed horses and mended tools. An electrical plant generated power for the mansion years before Asheville itself enjoyed reliable electricity. But that self-sufficiency came at a cost. Payroll alone represented a massive, continuous expense. Added to that were food for the staff, uniforms, housing, and basic medical care. The cost of simply keeping Biltmore alive month after month dwarfed what most American families would earn over an entire lifetime. The servants themselves remain mostly anonymous in the historical record. No detailed memoirs survive from the maids or gardeners. The estate archives preserve payroll lists, a few letters, and occasional notes, but the daily texture of their lives has to be reconstructed from fragments. We know their schedules were long and tightly controlled. The servants' wing and the basement work areas reveal a world, sharply separated from the luxury above their heads. Consider the kitchen. It occupied a vast space in the basement, equipped with some of the most modern appliances available in the 1890s. Multiple ovens lined the walls. A rotisserie, large enough to roast whole animals, turned slowly near the heat. There were deep sinks, long work tables, and shelves for storing hundreds of ingredients and tools. In summer, the temperature must have been punishing. During large dinners, the pace would have been relentless. A dumbwaiter carried food from the kitchen up to the butler's pantry on the main floor. From there, footmen moved silently into the banquet hall or dining room with loaded trays. The distance from stove to table was considerable. Keeping dishes hot and perfectly timed required coordination, precision, and speed from an entire team. The basement also housed the laundry, where women bent over large tubs, scrubbing linens before the installation of early washing machines. A pastry room allowed delicate baking to be done away from the worst of the kitchen heat. Storage rooms held everything from candles and tableware to sacks of flour and heaps of coal. Servants moved through a separate network of hallways and staircases designed to keep them out of sight. The architecture itself enforced the social boundary. You could work at Biltmore for years and never once walk through the front door as a guest. For the young men and women who arrived from the surrounding mountain communities, Biltmore represented something complicated. On one hand, it meant employment in a region where steady work was scarce. The wages were regular. The housing, while modest, was often better than what they had known at home. On the other hand, the work was physically demanding, the hours long, and the social distance between employer and employee immense. Some workers stayed for decades, building entire lives around the estate. Others left after a season or two, worn down by the demands or drawn away by other opportunities. In certain positions, the turnover seems to have been high, though exact figures are hard to pin down. What is clear is that George Vanderbilt treated his staff better than many industrialists of the era treated their workers. He offered housing, healthcare, and educational opportunities for employees' children. The estate operated a school, a church, and a small hospital. It was paternalism, not equality. But measured against the wider Gilded Age, it was relatively enlightened paternalism. George also hired local men to work in the forests. Frederick Law Olmsted had convinced him that scientific forestry could make the vast estate sustainable, rather than simply exploitative. Gifford Pinchot, who would later become the first chief of the United States Forest Service, managed Biltmore's forests in the mid-1890s. Later, Carl Schenck established the Biltmore Forest School, the first forestry school in America. Hundreds of men worked in the woods, planting saplings, clearing deadfall and managing timber harvests. The estate became a living laboratory for conservation practices that would eventually influence national policy. Yet for all the progressive forestry and relatively humane treatment of staff, one fact remained inescapable. Biltmore was a luxury built on labor. The beauty that guests admired required invisible hands to sustain it. The seamless operation of the household depended on a small army working in spaces those guests rarely, if ever, saw. George apparently understood this, at least in part. He was reportedly courteous to his staff, not prone to the tantrums or casual cruelties that defined some wealthy households. But recognizing an imbalance and correcting it are two very different things. By December of 1895, everything was finally ready. Construction was complete, the staff was trained. The furniture stood in its proper rooms. The art was hung. The books were shelved. The gardens, though still young, were planted and shaped. George invited his family to spend Christmas at Biltmore, his mother, his siblings, and a circle of close friends. The house would not open with a grand public ceremony, but with a private family gathering. On Christmas Eve, snow fell softly over the Blue Ridge Mountains. Inside, fires burned in dozens of fireplaces. Electric lights glowed in the windows. A massive Christmas tree stood in the banquet hall, heavy with candles and ornaments. For one night, the house fulfilled its purpose. It was beautiful. It was warm. It was alive. But even beneath the music, the laughter, and the glow of the tree, the mathematics of maintaining such a place were already taking shape. The dream was built. Now came the much harder work, keeping it standing. Chapter 3. The Golden Years That Weren't Quite Golden. The dream was built. Now came the much harder work of keeping it standing, and almost immediately, cracks began to show. Not in the limestone walls, but in the numbers. Biltmore was never designed to make money. It was designed to be beautiful. George Vanderbilt had poured millions into construction. He kept pouring money into operation. Staff salaries alone swallowed enormous sums. Then came maintenance. Heating a structure this size in winter required tons of coal. The grounds needed constant care. Repairs were continuous. Even with the estate farm producing food, the cost of running Biltmore far outweighed any trickle of revenue it produced. George's fortune was vast, but it was not infinite. The Vanderbilt money came primarily from railroads and shipping, industries built by his grandfather Cornelius. But that fortune had been sliced into many shares. George's portion was substantial, reportedly around $10 million at the time of his father's death. Yet a large part of that wealth now sat in stone, timber, and land at Biltmore. The estate was land-rich and cash-poor, a common problem among the very wealthy who owned more acres than liquid funds. For the first few years, after completion, this did not seem urgent. George lived quietly at Biltmore for part of each year, dividing his time between North Carolina, New York, and Europe. He read in his library. He rode through his forests. He hosted small, carefully chosen groups of friends. In those early seasons, the house appeared to function exactly as he had imagined it. Then, in 1898, something unexpected happened. George fell in love. Her name was Edith Stuyvesant Dresser. She came from an old New York family less wealthy than the Vanderbilts, but just as well connected. She was intelligent, widely traveled, and apparently unmoved by George's shyness or the intimidating scale of his house. They married in Paris in June of 1898. George was 36. Edith was 25. The marriage transformed Biltmore from a gentleman's retreat into something closer to a family home. Edith brought an energy and social confidence that George lacked. She hosted more. She involved herself in household management. She reportedly got along well with the staff and took a genuine interest in the welfare of estate workers. In 1900, their daughter Cornelia was born at Biltmore. She was christened in the estate's small chapel. Surrounded by family and by servants who had become, in a sense, an extended household. For a brief period, Biltmore seemed to justify itself. It was no longer just an extravagant monument to one man's taste. It was a home where a child was growing up, where daily life unfolded in rooms designed for beauty rather than efficiency. But the financial pressure never relaxed. George continued to invest in the estate's forestry operations, which were forward-thinking but slow to pay off. He supported the Biltmore Forest School, which trained foresters but did not generate real income. He maintained the elaborate gardens, the working farm, and the vast infrastructure required to keep the house alive. The estate needed a constant infusion of capital just to stay afloat. Beyond Biltmore's walls, the world was changing. The early 1900s brought new income taxes and a growing public skepticism toward extreme private wealth. The Gilded Age was ending. The Progressive Era was beginning. Enormous private estates began to look less like triumphs and more like uncomfortable symbols of inequality. George seemed to sense this shift. He rarely gave interviews. He avoided society pages and public spectacle. He ran Biltmore as a private sanctuary, not as a stage set for New York high society. But privacy carried its own price. The estate generated no ticket sales from visitors, no hotel income, no commercial revenue. It simply consumed. In 1914, George traveled to Washington, District of Columbia, for an emergency appendectomy. The surgery initially appeared successful. Then complications set in. On March 6, 1914, George Washington Vanderbilt II died. He was 51 years old. The news reached Biltmore by telegram. Edith was now a widow at 41. Cornelia was 13. Together they inherited a house that had been difficult to maintain even with George's fortune behind it. Edith now faced a choice that would define Biltmore's future. She could sell the estate outright. Several potential buyers apparently expressed interest, though finding someone willing to purchase a 250-room mansion in rural North Carolina was no simple task. She could carve up the property, selling off large tracts of land and keeping only a manageable core. Or she could fight to preserve what George had built. She chose to fight. But Edith was also practical. She understood numbers in a way George had never been forced to. She could see, almost immediately, that the estate was unsustainable in its existing form. Her first major decision reshaped Biltmore permanently. She sold approximately 87,000 acres of forest land to the federal government for just over $5 per acre. That land became part of Pisgah National Forest, one of the first national forests in the eastern United States. The sale accomplished two crucial things. It generated much-needed cash, and it reduced the ongoing cost of managing immense forest holdings that produced little direct income. Edith kept the house, the immediate grounds, and roughly 8,000 acres surrounding the estate. Still enormous, still expensive, but far more manageable than the empire George had originally assembled. She also reduced staffing, though the household still required dozens of workers to function. She cut back some of the more experimental agricultural projects. She tightened budgets in almost every corner of the operation. These were not cold financial maneuvers. They were painful compromises. Edith was trying to protect her late husband's dream while admitting that it could not survive exactly as he had imagined it. Cornelia came of age inside this altered Biltmore. Her childhood was privileged by any normal standard, yet it was shadowed by loss and by the constant awareness that the house was as much a burden as it was a treasure. She learned to ride horses through the estate forests that remained. She studied with private tutors in rooms designed by Richard Morris Hunt. She celebrated birthdays in a banquet hall larger than most people's entire homes. But she also grew up knowing that Biltmore was fragile, that it survived only because of continuous effort and sacrifice. The First World War added new pressures. Taxes climbed. Labor costs rose. The cultural mood turned sharply against ostentatious displays of wealth. All across the country, great private estates were closing, shrinking, or converting into schools, retreats, and institutions. Biltmore endured, but the golden years, if they had ever truly existed, were already gone. The house still stood, the lights still burned. But the dream was shifting into something George had never planned for. It was becoming a burden that would soon require a miracle to survive. Chapter 4. The Roaring Twenties and a House Out of Time. It was becoming a burden that would require a miracle to survive. The 1920s would test whether miracles were still possible or whether Biltmore was simply too large for the world it now inhabited. The decade after the war brought dramatic change to America. Cities expanded. Cars replaced carriages. Jazz drifted from radios and ordinary homes. Women cut their hair short, wore new fashions, and voted in national elections. The country was rushing forward, embracing modernity and speed. Biltmore remained frozen in another era. The house still operated much as it had in 1895. Servants moved through hidden corridors. Formal dinners demanded multiple courses and carefully choreographed service. The routines of the estate, the gardens, the farm, the endless maintenance, continued largely unchanged. But the world around Biltmore was changing faster than the estate could adapt. Cornelia Vanderbilt came of age during this period. She turned 21 in 1921, officially inheriting control of the estate alongside her mother. She was young, wealthy, and suddenly one of the most eligible women in America. Her debut made national news. Photographers wanted her picture. Society columnists tracked her movements. She embodied something Americans found both fascinating and faintly absurd: inherited wealth on a scale that seemed increasingly out of place in a modern, restless country. Cornelia apparently felt the weight of that expectation. She had grown up in a house that was, in many ways, already a museum. Her childhood playmates were the children of estate workers. Her education had been private, curated, and sheltered. Now she was expected to navigate New York society, manage an enormous property, and somehow make sense of a fortune that came with obligations no one had prepared her for. In 1924, she married John Francis Amherst Cecil, an English aristocrat with an impressive title and very little money. The wedding took place at All Souls Church in Biltmore Village, the small community just outside the estate gates. Thousands of people lined the streets to watch. For North Carolina, it was reportedly the social event of the season. The marriage seemed to promise continuity. John would help manage the estate. Cornelia would fulfill her duty to preserve what her father had built. Together, they would find a way to make Biltmore viable. Viability, however, remained elusive. The estate still consumed money faster than it generated income. The working farm produced food for the household, but not real profit. The forests, now reduced in size, brought in some timber revenue, but nothing close to what was needed. Tourism was not yet an option. Biltmore remained a private residence, its doors closed to the public. The staff, though smaller than in George's time, still numbered in the dozens. Maids cleaned rooms that were rarely used. Gardeners maintained landscapes that few outside the family and their guests ever saw. The infrastructure, heating, electrical systems, plumbing, required constant repair and occasional modernization. John Cecil apparently tried to streamline and modernize operations. He encouraged more efficient farming methods. He searched for ways to draw income from the land. But he was fighting the same basic equation George had ignored. A house this size, in this location, with no commercial purpose, could not support itself. Meanwhile, the culture was shifting in ways that made Biltmore increasingly hard to justify. The 1920s saw growing labor activism, unions organized, workers demanded better pay and better conditions, newspapers reported strikes and factory protests. The gap between the Vanderbilt lifestyle and the lives of ordinary Americans became harder to ignore and harder to defend. Biltmore did employ local people. It paid reasonably by the standards of the time and offered benefits many employers did not. The estate provided housing, a degree of security, and sometimes education for workers' children. But the underlying dynamic, one wealthy family served by a permanent servant class, looked more and more like a relic. Some staff members stayed for decades, suggesting they found stability or even pride in the work. Others left after shorter periods. Turnover in certain positions was steady. Estate records hint at staffing difficulties, though the surviving details are thin. What is clear is that by the late 1920s, finding young people willing to enter domestic service was getting harder. The booming economy created factory jobs that paid better. Cities offered more freedom, entertainment, and anonymity. For many young men and women, working as a maid or footman in a remote mountain mansion held far less appeal than it once had. Edith, now in her 50s, watched these changes with growing concern. She had preserved Biltmore through the war and the turbulent years that followed. She had made painful choices and sold off huge tracts of land, but she could see that larger social and economic forces were beginning to threaten the estate's very survival. The house required young workers willing to accept traditional roles. It required an economy where maintaining such properties still made some kind of sense. It required a culture that valued private grandeur as an ideal. All of that was disappearing. Asheville itself was changing. The small mountain town George had discovered in the 1880s was slowly becoming a small city. New downtown hotels rose to serve visitors. Tourism increased, driven by the mountain scenery and the mild climate. Local leaders were beginning to understand that Asheville's future might lie not in factories or farms, but in attracting travelers. Biltmore sat just outside town, enormous and invisible. Thousands of tourists came to Asheville every year. Almost none of them saw the largest private house in America because it remained locked away behind its gates. The question was starting to form, even if almost no one said it aloud. Could Biltmore survive as a purely private residence, or would it have to become something else entirely? In 1928, Cornelia gave birth to 2 sons, George and William. The estate had heirs again. The Vanderbilt line would continue, but 2 young boys only increased the financial pressure. They would need education, health care, and eventually inheritances of their own. The estate was no longer supporting just Edith and Cornelia. It was now responsible for a growing family whose financial needs stretched decades into the future. Then came October of 1929. The stock market crashed. Banks failed. Investments vaporized. Fortunes that had seemed untouchable vanished almost overnight. The Roaring Twenties ended abruptly, and the Great Depression began. Biltmore was about to face its greatest test. The house had survived construction costs, George's death, and the cultural shifts of the post-war years. Now it would have to withstand an economic collapse on a national scale. The question was no longer whether Biltmore could thrive. The question was whether it could survive at all. And the answer would depend on a decision that, only a few years earlier, would have been unthinkable. Chapter 5. Depression, Desperation, and Opening the Doors. And the answer would require a decision that just a few years earlier would have sounded unthinkable. Biltmore would have to open its doors to strangers. The crash hit Asheville especially hard. The city had borrowed heavily during the boom years, financing hotels and infrastructure based on rosy predictions of endless growth. When the economy collapsed, those optimistic numbers turned into anchors. Asheville was suddenly buried under debts it could not possibly repay. Banks failed. Construction sites froze mid-project. Skeletons of buildings standing over empty streets. Unemployment soared. By some accounts, Asheville carried the highest per capita municipal debt in the entire United States. The city would not finish paying off its Depression-era bonds until 1976. For Biltmore, the crisis was just as severe, but it looked different on paper. The Vanderbilt fortune was diversified, which gave the family some protection. But investments still lost value. Dividends shrank. Income from remaining holdings dropped sharply. Operating costs at the estate, already barely manageable, now became genuinely dangerous. Edith and Cornelia were trapped in the same impossible equation. The house required enormous sums, simply to keep breathing. Staff had to be paid. Buildings had to be heated. A property that size could not simply be turned off for a few years. Deferred maintenance on a cottage is an annoyance. Deferred maintenance on a stone palace becomes permanent damage. Yet the money to cover those costs was harder and harder to find. Layoffs became unavoidable. The staff was reduced to a skeleton crew. Entire positions disappeared. Workers who had spent years, in some cases decades, at Biltmore were let go, joining the long lines of unemployed across the region. Those who remained accepted pay cuts. They worked longer hours, taking on duties from roles that no longer existed. The estate ran on the thinnest possible margin, held together by loyalty, habit, and hope. Even that was not enough. The estate was slowly dying. Then came the proposal that would change everything. City leaders in Asheville approached the Vanderbilt family with a suggestion. The city was desperate for any kind of economic activity. Tourism was one of the few industries that might still limp through the Depression. People who had enough money to travel were still traveling, perhaps less often, but they were out there, looking for distraction from the grinding fear of the daily headlines. Asheville had scenery. It had clean mountain air. It had a mild climate, but it lacked a single, unforgettable attraction that could pull visitors from far away. What if Biltmore opened to the public? The idea was shocking. The house had been private from the day it was finished. George had built it as a refuge from public scrutiny, not as a showpiece. Opening it to paying visitors felt like turning his most personal statement into an exhibit. But George was gone, and the people still paying the bills had to make choices the dead never had to face. Edith apparently resisted at first, the thought of strangers walking through her home, staring at family photographs, peering into spaces where she had grieved and celebrated. It must have felt like an invasion. Biltmore was where her husband had died, where Cornelia had taken her first steps, where her grandsons were now learning to walk. How do you put a ticket price on your own life? Cornelia and John Cecil saw the situation differently, or perhaps more sharply. They had 2 young sons to raise, an immense house to protect, and a pile of obligations that did not care about sentiment. Pride was a luxury they could no longer afford. In 1930, Biltmore House opened to the public for the first time. The move was presented as temporary, a special Depression-era measure that would end once the economy recovered. In reality, it was a one-way door. The house would never again exist as a purely private home. The first tickets cost $1 per person. Visitors could walk through the main formal rooms, the banquet hall, the library, the winter garden, while the family's private living spaces remained closed. Guides led small groups through the house, telling its story and pointing out details most guests would have missed on their own. The response was immediate. People arrived by the hundreds, then by the thousands. Locals came from Asheville and nearby mountain towns. Others drove in from neighboring states. Some travelers made the journey from as far away as New York and Florida. For Americans living through the Depression, Biltmore offered something rare: escape. For the price of a ticket and a few hours of time, you could step into a different universe. You could see how the other half, really, the other fraction of a percent, had lived. You could run your hand along Italian marble, walk on rugs woven in Persia, and stand in front of paintings worth more than most people would earn in a lifetime. It was mesmerizing and unsettling at the same time. Some visitors felt pure awe. Others felt anger at such concentrated wealth when so many had so little. Many felt both emotions at once. The Depression had made inequality impossible to ignore. Biltmore stood there as stone proof of the distance between rich and poor. But people kept coming. They kept buying tickets. And the trickle of money started to matter. Ticket sales did not solve everything. The house was simply too expensive to be fully supported by admission fees alone, but the revenue helped. It provided cash flow. The difference between shutting down and limping forward. It gave the estate a new reason to exist, not only as a family home, but as a place people came to see. It also changed what work at Biltmore meant. The remaining maids, gardeners, and maintenance workers were no longer just serving a single wealthy household behind closed doors. They were keeping a public site running. They were part of a local economy trying to survive. That did not erase the hierarchy, but it did add a layer of purpose. Edith apparently never fully embraced this new identity. She spent less and less time at Biltmore after the opening, choosing instead to stay in Washington, District of Columbia, or to travel abroad. The house had become something she no longer recognized, or no longer wanted to face every day. Cornelia seemed to adapt more easily, at least at first. She and John managed the tourist operations while trying to preserve some semblance of private family life in the closed sections of the house. It was an awkward compromise. A home in one wing, a museum in another. But it worked well enough to keep the doors open. The estate began experimenting with other revenue sources. Dairy products were sold commercially. The estate's inn, which in George's time had housed overflow guests, welcomed paying visitors. Small souvenirs and gift items appeared for sale. These were modest steps, but together they pointed toward a future in which Biltmore would have to function as a business, not just a residence with a big heating bill. The Depression dragged on. Year after year, the recovery everyone hoped for failed to materialize. Tourism rose and fell with the seasons and with people's wallets, but it never stopped entirely. Enough visitors kept coming to keep the experiment alive. By the mid-1930s, the immediate emergency had eased. Biltmore was not thriving, but it was no longer on the edge of collapse. The house still stood. The doors were still open. The ticket window still had customers. Survival, however, had its own price. Biltmore had been transformed from a private dream into a public commodity. The family had traded a measure of their privacy and control for solvency. The house was now part home, part symbol, part business. Whether George would have approved is impossible to know. Whether Edith ever truly accepted it is doubtful. But Cornelia and John had made their choice. Faced with the alternatives, they chose survival over purity. The house would remain standing. And strangers would walk its halls for as long as it existed. The Depression would eventually end. But once those doors had opened, they would never fully close again. Chapter 6. War, Secrets, and the Art that Hid in the Mountains. The Depression would eventually end, but the doors, once opened, would never fully close again. And before any real recovery could take hold, another crisis arrived. One that would temporarily turn Biltmore into something almost no one could have imagined. The late 1930s brought rising tension in Europe. Hitler's Germany was expanding. One country after another fell under occupation. War seemed less like a possibility and more like a countdown. And inside the art world, a quiet kind of panic began. America's great museums held collections worth hundreds of millions of dollars, masterpieces that defined Western culture, paintings and sculptures that could never be replaced if they were destroyed. Museum directors started asking a question no one really wanted to say out loud. What happens to these treasures if war ever reaches American soil? The answer required a hiding place, somewhere remote, somewhere structurally secure, somewhere with enough infrastructure to store and protect fragile, treasures, frail priceless objects for years. Someone suggested Biltmore. In 1941, representatives from the National Gallery of Art in Washington visited the estate. They were searching for safe storage far from coastal cities or obvious bombing targets. Biltmore offered a rare combination of advantages. It was inland, in the mountains, distant from any major industrial center. Its stone construction was solid. It had interior spaces that were naturally stable in temperature and, crucially, not needed for daily operations or tourism. And it had one particularly promising space: the music room. George Vanderbilt had planned an enormous music room on the first floor, but he never finished it. The space existed, more than 2,000 square feet, yet it remained incomplete, closed to visitors, and used mainly as a large, empty storage area. Negotiations were conducted quietly. In early 1942, shortly after Pearl Harbor pulled the United States fully into the war, the agreement was finalized. Biltmore would shelter artwork from the National Gallery for as long as the conflict made that necessary. The operation was kept secret. Heavily guarded trucks arrived at night, carrying wooden crates packed with carefully wrapped paintings and sculptures. Armed guards oversaw the unloading. Workers moved the crates into the unfinished music room and stacked them in precise rows, each box labeled and logged. The public knew nothing. Tourists continued to visit Biltmore, walking past closed doors behind which some of the most valuable art in the world sat hidden in the dark. What exactly was stored there? The full inventory remained classified for years, but reports suggest the collection included works by Raphael, Rembrandt, Van Dyck, and other giants. The famous Gilbert Stuart portrait of George Washington, the one reproduced on the $1 bill, reportedly spent the war years at Biltmore, along with many other irreplaceable pieces from the National Gallery's holdings. Security was strict but understated. Guards were present, but their purpose was not publicly explained. The music room was simply declared off-limits, hardly unusual in a house where many rooms were closed to visitors for various reasons. For Edith and Cornelia, the arrangement must have felt bittersweet. The house George had built was serving the nation during a global emergency, but it was doing so as a vault, not as a home. The music room that was supposed to echo with music and conversation now held crates of unseen art, masterpieces wrapped in paper, and silence. The estate helped the war effort in more visible ways as well. The farm increased production to support food rationing and local supply. Estate workers took part in scrap metal drives and war bond campaigns. Young men who had worked at Biltmore enlisted or were drafted and went overseas wearing uniforms instead of livery. Tourism, which had become the estate's lifeline during the Depression, continued, but at a much lower level. Gasoline rationing made travel difficult and expensive. Families had more urgent worries than visiting a mansion. Ticket revenue that had once kept Biltmore afloat dropped sharply. The estate survived the war years in a kind of suspended animation: reduced staff, minimal repairs, hidden paintings, a great house waiting for peace and for a plan. The art stayed at Biltmore until 1944, when the tide of war turned clearly in favor of the Allies. The threat of bombing American cities receded. The crates were carefully loaded back onto trucks and returned to Washington, their secret mountain refuge no longer needed. The music room was empty again. The story of what had been stored there slowly became public and eventually turned into a point of pride. Biltmore had protected a piece of America's artistic heritage at the moment it seemed most at risk. But the war years had taken their toll in ways that were less dramatic and more dangerous. Deferred maintenance had stacked up. Roofs needed serious repair. Stonework was weathering and cracking. Mechanical systems installed in the 1890s were now more than 50 years old and failing. For nearly 2 decades, through the Depression and the war, Biltmore had been run in emergency mode, always choosing the cheapest short-term fix. The consequences were beginning to show in the walls themselves. In 1958, Edith died at the age of 84. She had outlived George by 44 years. She had preserved the estate through financial collapse and global conflict, making compromises he never had to imagine. Her death removed the last living link to Biltmore's original purpose as one man's private sanctuary. At the same time, Cornelia's life was becoming more complicated in ways that would ripple through the estate. Her marriage to John Cecil was unraveling. By the early 1950s, the couple had separated, though they never formally divorced. Cornelia spent more and more time away from Biltmore and eventually moved permanently to England. That absence created a practical crisis. Someone had to run the estate. Someone had to make decisions about repairs, staffing, and the long-term future. The answer came from the next generation. Cornelia's 2 sons, George and William Cecil, were now young men. They had grown up in the strange half-world of Biltmore, part family home, part tourist attraction. But they had also lived in England and studied there. They had options. They could have walked away from the burden their great-grandfather had created and left the estate to crumble slowly. Instead, they chose to stay involved. And unlike previous generations, they were ready to think of Biltmore not just as an inheritance, but as a business that needed to work or die. George and William looked at the estate with fresh eyes. They saw the beauty and the history, of course, but they also saw outdated ticket booths, tired facilities, and a visitor experience that felt improvised rather than intentional. The tourism operation was amateurish. The marketing was minimal. The estate was relying on its name and size, instead of giving guests a clear reason to come back or recommend it to others. The Cecil brothers understood something their parents and grandparents had only half accepted. Biltmore could not survive as a reluctant compromise between private residence and public attraction. It needed to embrace being a destination or risk losing everything. That meant more than just leaving the doors open. It meant restoration instead of patching, professional management instead of improvised decisions. It meant thinking of visitors not as a necessary inconvenience, but as the core purpose of the entire operation. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, this realization was only beginning to take shape. The house stood at a crossroads. It had survived construction, the death of its founder, economic collapse, and a world war. Now it would have to endure something even more complicated, becoming truly modern without losing its soul. That transformation would require vision, serious investment, and a willingness to change almost everything while protecting what mattered most. It would demand, in its own way, a gamble as audacious as George's original decision to build a palace in the North Carolina mountains. Chapter 7. The Brother Who Bet Everything on a Crumbling Palace. It would require, in other words, a gamble as audacious as George's original decision to build, and one brother would make that bet, while the other chose a very different path. By 1960, the situation was critical. Biltmore was losing money. Visitor numbers were flat. The house was decaying in ways that could no longer be disguised with fresh paint or closed doors. George and William Cecil faced the same estate, but they saw very different futures. Management responsibilities had been divided informally. George Henry Vanderbilt Cecil, the elder brother, took primary control of the dairy operation and the surrounding agricultural lands. William Amherst Vanderbilt Cecil focused on the house itself and the fragile tourism business. The dairy was profitable, or at least reliably sustainable. It produced milk, cheese, and ice cream sold throughout the region. The agricultural operations fit easily into a modern balance sheet. They generated revenue. They provided jobs. Their costs and returns could be calculated on a ledger. The house did none of that. When William looked at Biltmore House, he saw something most people would have written off as a beautiful ruin. The roof leaked in multiple places. Water stains bled through ceilings and walls. The heating system, cutting edge in 1895, was now inefficient and failing. Electrical wiring needed total replacement. Plumbing lines were corroded and unreliable. The visitor side was just as bleak. There was no proper visitor center, no real restaurant. Parking was limited and awkward. The gift shop was small, poorly supplied, and treated as an afterthought. Tours felt improvised. Undertrained guides, inconsistent stories, no clear sense of beginning, middle, or end. Annual attendance hovered around perhaps 50,000 visitors. Enough to keep the lights on? Barely. Nowhere near enough to pay for the mountain of repairs the house demanded. A cold, rational analysis pointed toward one conclusion: get rid of it. Sell the property. Donate it to the government or a foundation. Let someone else inherit the headache. Many other Gilded Age mansions had already gone that route. Private ownership simply could not carry the cost of these palaces into the modern era. But William Cecil was not interested in the rational escape route. He was interested in Biltmore. He had grown up inside those walls, played as a child in those corridors, watched tourists file through rooms that still felt like family spaces. He understood that Biltmore was not only a family story, but a piece of American history, a physical record of the Gilded Age, of ambition, and of its consequences. And he believed, against plenty of evidence, that it could be saved if it was finally run like a serious enterprise. This was not blind nostalgia. William had studied business. He had worked in banking and finance. He approached Biltmore with a balance sheet in one hand and a deep emotional investment in the other. His diagnosis was blunt. The house was failing not only because it was expensive, but because it was being managed as a burden instead of an opportunity. Tourism was treated as an unavoidable nuisance, starved of money, planning, and talent. No one had clear authority. Decisions drifted or were diluted by committee. William proposed something radical. He would take operational control of the house and the tourism operation. He would restructure it as a for-profit company, not a half-reluctant family project. He would spend heavily on restoration and visitor services, gambling that a dramatically better experience would attract more guests and generate the income needed to keep the building alive. The risk was enormous. The required investment was staggering, especially for a business already losing money. There was no guarantee the visitors would come. The family agreed, perhaps because every other option looked worse. In 1960, William Cecil became president of the Biltmore Company. He was 30 years old. He moved fast. And the changes startled people who had worked on the estate for decades. First, he imposed professional standards. Guides were trained instead of simply handed a few facts. Tours were scripted to tell a clear, engaging story, rather than a loose collection of dates and room names. Staff uniforms were standardized. The entire visit was treated as an experience to be designed, not as a polite wander through a big house. Second, he invested in infrastructure that, on paper, had nothing to do with a grand mansion, but had everything to do with whether visitors enjoyed their time there. He pushed for a proper parking lot, a real visitor center, restrooms that actually worked and could handle crowds. These upgrades were not romantic, but they were essential. Third, and most controversially, he raised ticket prices. Admission that had lingered at $1 or $2 for years was increased to levels that reflected the true value of what guests were seeing. It was a bold move. Would people still pay to come, or would higher prices drive them away? William knew that without more revenue, the rest of his plan was meaningless. Fourth, he began the slow, brutally expensive process of authentic restoration. Not quick fixes or cosmetic patches, but serious conservation. That meant hiring specialists, sourcing appropriate stone and slate, rebuilding damaged sections correctly, and addressing hidden structural problems no visitor would ever see. But everyone would feel if the building failed. The restoration work exposed just how fragile Biltmore had become. Stone was crumbling in critical areas. Steel supports were rusting through. The slate roof, in place since the 1890s, had failed in many sections, letting water seep in year after year. Some original materials could not be salvaged. They had to be carefully replicated and replaced. The bills were enormous. William borrowed heavily, using parts of the estate as collateral to fund the repairs. He was effectively wagering the future of Biltmore on its ability to earn its own rescue. If the plan failed, creditors would take the property piece by piece. And then something unexpected happened. People started to come. At first, the increase was modest, a slow rise rather than a sudden surge, but the trend was unmistakable. Word spread that Biltmore was changing. The tours felt sharper and more engaging. The grounds were better maintained. The overall experience simply felt more cared for. By the mid-1960s, attendance had roughly doubled compared with a decade earlier. Revenue climbed with it. For the first time in generations, the house was bringing in enough money not only to cover daily operations, but to push the restoration work forward. William poured everything back into the property. Every spare dollar went to improvements. More rooms were restored. Additional sections of the house and gardens were open to visitors. A proper restaurant gave guests a reason to stay on the grounds longer. A small wine shop began selling bottles connected to the estate's farming tradition. Vines had grown at Biltmore since George Vanderbilt's time, mostly as part of the ideal of a self-sufficient estate. William saw a chance to turn that legacy into a new revenue stream. He hired a professional winemaker and started producing wine in serious quantities. The Biltmore Estate Winery opened in 1985 and would eventually become one of the most visited wineries in America. Each new addition served a double purpose. It made the visit richer and more memorable, encouraging longer stays and repeat trips, and it generated new income that could be cycled back into preservation. William was building a flywheel. Better facilities and storytelling drew more visitors. More visitors produced more revenue. More revenue funded more restoration and new offerings, which in turn attracted even more visitors. It worked. Slowly, expensively, and with constant risk. But it worked. By the 1970s, Biltmore was no longer bleeding money. It was roughly breaking even, then moving cautiously into profitability. The house that had been a financial curse for generations was becoming, almost unbelievably, a self-sustaining enterprise. But self-sustaining did not mean safe. A house that size never stops needing attention. Roofs age, stone erodes, electrical and mechanical systems wear out. The job is never finished. William understood that perfectly. He was not trying to rescue Biltmore for a comfortable, maintenance-free future. He was building a system in which constant, disciplined work and reinvestment could keep the place alive decade after decade. The gamble was paying off, yet it remained a gamble. One serious downturn, one disaster. One string of bad decisions could still undo everything. The house stood. The visitors kept arriving. And William Cecil kept working, betting his time, his money, and his name on the belief that a crumbling Gilded Age palace could reinvent itself and endure. Chapter 8. From Burden to Business, the Transformation. Nobody expected. The house stood, the visitors came, and William Cecil worked. But work alone would not be enough. The real transformation required changing how people thought about Biltmore itself. By the 1980s, the results of William's strategy were hard to dismiss. Annual attendance had climbed to several 100,000 visitors. The house was not just covering its costs, it was profitable. Restoration was no longer a crisis response, but a steady, ongoing program. More importantly, the entire philosophy of the estate had shifted. Biltmore was no longer pretending to be something it was not. It was no longer a private home that reluctantly tolerated tourists as a necessary evil. It had become a historic house museum run deliberately as a for-profit business. That distinction mattered. As a business, every major decision could be tested instead of simply felt. Would this restoration campaign attract more visitors? Would this new amenity make the guest experience meaningfully better? Would this investment ever pay itself back? These became practical questions with measurable answers, not vague issues of family pride or abstract duty to history. William brought in professional managers from the worlds of hospitality and tourism, people who understood crowd flow, signage, and customer expectations. People who could look at a mansion with roughly 250 rooms and see not only heritage, but capacity and logistics. The changes reached far beyond the stone walls of the house. The grounds that Frederick Law Olmsted had designed in the 1890s received serious attention again. The formal gardens were restored toward their original layouts. The conservatory was repaired and revived. New walking trails were laid out and maintained. Slowly, the estate became a destination not just for people who loved rooms and architecture, but for visitors who came primarily for the landscape. Seasonal programming was added, a Christmas celebration that wrapped the house in lights, trees, and music, spring garden festivals that turned the grounds into color and fragrance, summer concerts on the lawn with the house as a backdrop. These events stretched the tourism season and gave past visitors a reason to return. The winery expanded dramatically. What had begun as a modest operation, making limited quantities of wine, turned into a major attraction of its own. Visitors could tour the production facilities, see the barrels, taste different varieties, and then buy bottles to take home. The winery generated real revenue and gave Biltmore a brand presence that traveled far beyond people who could physically visit North Carolina. An inn was built on the estate, finally allowing guests to stay overnight on the property. Later, a second, larger hotel followed. These were not budget motels. They were upper-end accommodations that charged premium rates. And they worked. People wanted to stretch a 3-hour tour into a 2- or 3-day experience. Each expansion triggered the same unease. Was Biltmore sliding toward becoming a theme park? Was authenticity being chipped away in favor of profit? William's answer was consistently practical and blunt. The house survived because it made money. Money came from visitors. Visitors came back when they had a genuinely good time. A good time required investment in parking lots, bathrooms, restaurants, and events. The marble ceilings and historic tapestries did not pay their own bills. Everything was connected. At the same time, he refused to let Biltmore become cheap. The restaurants aimed to serve genuinely good food, not just fast snacks. The hotels were truly comfortable, not historic in name only. The wine had to be drinkable, not just a souvenir with a pretty label. Biltmore was commercial, yes, but it was commercial in a premium way. The goal was not to pack in the maximum number of people. It was to offer a high-quality experience that justified the price. This approach set Biltmore apart from many other grand houses. Most comparable estates operated as non-profit organizations, dependent on donations, foundation grants, and occasional government support. They were preserved but static, carefully maintained but rarely able to grow or experiment. Biltmore was different. It played in the open market. It competed for visitors against theme parks, city breaks, beach resorts, and national parks. Every year it had to justify its existence through ticket sales, hotel reservations, restaurant checks, and bottles of wine. That pressure created stress but also energy. The estate could never lean back and rely on the magic words historic significance as a guarantee. It had to earn its survival over and over again. The preservation work itself became more sophisticated. Specialists in conservation came in to study and repair everything from roof trusses to Renaissance tapestries. Archives were cataloged properly. Original furnishings were conserved instead of casually replaced. The goal shifted from keep the house standing to preserve it at museum-level quality while still letting people walk through it. All of this was expensive and endless, but the business model now had the strength to support it. The house generated enough income to pay for its own conservation and still leave a margin for new projects. By the 1990s, Biltmore was drawing close to 1 million visitors a year. It employed more than 1,000 people, making it one of the largest private employers in the region. The dairy, the winery, the hotels, the restaurants, the retail shops. Together they formed an economic engine that would have stunned George Vanderbilt. William Cecil had pulled off something quietly radical. He had taken a failing, decaying symbol of the Gilded Age and turned it into a healthy business without stripping away the very history that made the place worth saving. But success brought its own set of problems. As Biltmore's popularity grew, the estate ran into physical limits. Parking became a headache during peak seasons. Tour capacity was constrained by the narrowness of staircases and the size of historic rooms. The fragile balance between allowing access and protecting delicate interiors required constant adjustment. Too many people, and the house suffered. Too few, and the finances did. Another question loomed in the background. Succession. William had children. Would they want to spend their lives managing this complicated machine? Would they have both the skill and the stubbornness to continue? The estate had already passed through several generations, and each transition had been a moment of danger. In 1995, Biltmore celebrated its 100th anniversary. A full century had passed since that first Christmas gathering when George Vanderbilt opened his new house to his family. The celebration was big, polished, and very public, drawing national media coverage. The anniversary forced a kind of reckoning. Look at the distance the estate had traveled, from private palace to financial disaster, to barely surviving relic, to successful business, from a remote, closed world on a hill to a cornerstone of the region's economy, from heavy burden to valuable asset. George would hardly recognize what his house had become. The private library where he once sat reading in silence now saw hundreds of tourists every day. The banquet hall that had hosted intimate dinners now held corporate events and large gatherings. The service corridors built to keep servants invisible now carried maintenance crews and catering staff serving thousands of guests a week. And yet, the building itself was still there. The limestone walls, the great staircase, the carved ceilings, not only intact, but preserved at a standard that would have been unthinkable without the money brought in by tourism, wine, and hotels. That was William Cecil's legacy. He saved Biltmore not by freezing it in time, but by changing almost everything around it while refusing to let the core be cheapened. The model he created did not stay hidden in the mountains. Other historic properties studied Biltmore's example. Some adopted similar strategies and leaned into commercialization as the price of survival. Others rejected the idea, choosing to remain lean, donation-driven nonprofits. Neither path was perfect Both came with compromises. But Biltmore proved one uncomfortable, powerful truth. A private, for-profit approach to preservation could work even for properties that looked far too large and far too expensive to save. William Cecil died in 2017 at the age of 85. He had spent more than half a century steering Biltmore from slow decline to stable success. His children stepped into leadership roles, suggesting that the system he built was strong enough to outlive him. The house stood, not as George Vanderbilt imagined it, but standing all the same. And millions of people had walked through rooms that, without that transformation, might have collapsed into dust and memory. Chapter 9. The People Who Keep the Dream Alive. And millions of people had walked through rooms that might otherwise have crumbled into ruin. But those rooms did not care for themselves. Behind every polished surface and smooth, seamless tour was an army of workers whose labor remained mostly invisible. By the early 2000s, Biltmore employed more than 2,000 people during peak season: housekeepers, gardeners, security guards, tour guides, chefs, sommeliers, hotel staff, maintenance crews, retail workers, administrative teams. The roster stretched far beyond anything George Vanderbilt's original household could have imagined. These were not servants in the 19th century sense. They were employees of a modern corporation. They received benefits, had job titles, performance reviews, and potential career paths. Many had spent decades at Biltmore, building deep expertise in narrow, highly specialized areas. Yet in another sense, their work still echoed that of the first staff. Rooms needed cleaning, gardens needed tending, boilers, pumps, and wiring needed constant attention. The tools had changed, the employment contracts had changed, but the basic tasks, keeping a vast estate alive, remained stubbornly the same. Consider the housekeeping staff. Every morning before the estate opens, teams move through the public rooms dusting, vacuuming, and checking for any new wear or damage. With roughly 1 million visitors each year, the strain on fabrics, floors, railings, and furniture is immense. One greasy fingerprint on a gilded frame is nothing. Multiply that by tens of thousands of hands, and it becomes a conservation emergency. Housekeepers work side by side with conservators to understand exactly what can and cannot be used on century-old materials. A modern cleaning spray that works fine in a hotel room can destroy antique textiles or finishes. The staff has to walk a tightrope, deliver the level of cleanliness today's visitors expect, without accidentally stripping away delicate surfaces that cannot be replaced. Outside in the gardens, the challenges are just as intricate. The formal landscapes require care in every season. Plants must look appropriate to the historical period and original design, but they also have to withstand current climate conditions, pests, and heavy foot traffic. The azaleas that explode into color each spring must be pruned, fertilized, protected from disease, and shielded from careless feet and camera tripods. Acres of lawn have to be mowed, edged, and repaired to standards that would still satisfy Olmsted's demanding eye. To do this, the estate employs full-time horticulturists, arborists, and landscape workers. They keep an inventory of every significant tree, monitor for blight and storm damage, and plan years ahead for replacements. A mature tree takes decades to grow. A decision made today about what to plant will shape what visitors see in the year 2050 and beyond. Then there are the quiet specialists inside the house. A staff curator oversees the collection of furniture, art, textiles, and decorative objects. Every item is cataloged, photographed, and monitored. Its condition is recorded. Its history is researched and updated. When a piece needs conservation, outside experts are consulted or brought in for painstaking work. The library alone contains more than 20,000 volumes, many of them rare or first editions. A dedicated librarian and support staff maintain the collection, checking for insect damage, watching for mold, and adjusting humidity and temperature. On rare occasions, researchers are allowed supervised access to specific books, a reminder that this is still a working library, not just a backdrop. The mechanical systems demand just as much attention. The original electrical system has been completely replaced, but in a way that leaves the historic rooms looking unchanged. Modern fire suppression snakes through ceilings and walls, largely invisible to visitors. Updated climate control systems work constantly to hold temperature and humidity within narrow bands, protecting wood, fabric, and paint from slow, silent decay. When something fails, and in a building this large, something is always failing, maintenance crews have to move quickly and quietly. A leaking pipe in a public hallway cannot wait until the off-season. Repairs must happen while tours still pass nearby, with as little disruption as possible. Guests see a perfect room. Behind the scenes, someone has just climbed out of a crawl space with a wrench. The tour guides themselves show how much Biltmore's operation has evolved. In the early days, guides were often employees who had worked in other roles and simply knew the house. Today, guiding is its own profession. New guides go through extensive training, not just dates and names, but crowd management, storytelling techniques, and ways to handle sensitive questions. They learn to adjust their delivery for school groups, retirement tours, architecture fans, and families with bored children. A skilled guide makes the past feel close. George Vanderbilt becomes not just a name, but a shy young man hiding inside a grand project. Edith's choices stop being abstract and start looking like decisions a real person had to make in the middle of financial and emotional pressure. Visitors are gently reminded that this place was never just built. It was lived in, argued over, and saved again and again. Beyond the house, the hospitality side, restaurants, hotels, the winery, employs hundreds more. These are modern operations that happen to be wrapped in history, which creates its own complications. The inn has to deliver current expectations of comfort, technology, and service, while visually fitting into a 19th century estate. The restaurants must move food fast enough for bus tours and families on a schedule, but still maintain quality that matches the prices and the setting. The winery has grown into a serious business, producing more than 100,000 cases of wine each year. The team includes trained viticulturists, enologists, and cellar workers. They manage vineyards through frost, pests, and storms. They monitor fermentations, top up barrels, blend wines, and bottle finished product in a facility that mixes stainless steel tanks with rows of oak barrels. What stands out is how many people stay. For the hospitality industry, where rapid turnover is normal, Biltmore's retention is unusually strong. Seasonal workers return year after year. Entry-level hires grow into supervisors, managers, and specialists. It is not rare to meet employees who have been with the estate for 20 or 30 years. There are practical reasons for this. Biltmore is a major employer in western North Carolina, offering more stability than many local jobs. But there is something deeper at work. Many employees talk about meaning. A housekeeper who has tended the library for 20 years does not just clean it. She knows the angle of every chair, the way the light falls in late afternoon, which volumes visitors always try to touch. If a book is slightly out of line, she notices immediately. She takes personal pride in keeping a cultural artifact intact. A gardener who has cared for the same beds for 15 seasons comes to see individual plants as old acquaintances. He remembers which rosebush supposedly drew George Vanderbilt's attention. He knows which tree was planted to replace a storm-damaged original. When he looks at the formal garden, he sees not just color, but continuity. This sense of stewardship. of being one link in a chain that stretches backward and forward in time, matters. Many employees describe Biltmore not just as a workplace, but as a place they feel responsible for, something they are helping hand off to people who are not born yet. The estate itself has become more intentional about acknowledging these contributions. Recent tours and exhibits spend more time on the stories of servants, construction crews, artisans, and long-term staff. Old photographs of maids, kitchen workers, and groundsmen appear alongside portraits of the Vanderbilts. The narrative is slowly broadening. There is a growing recognition that Biltmore's story makes no sense if it is told only through the family's perspective. The house was never just one man's achievement. It was always a collective project. Thousands of people over more than a century. Even if that truth went unspoken for most of its history. Today, when a visitor walks through Biltmore, they are seeing the work of many hands layered together. The guide telling the story, the housekeeper who was there at dawn, the gardener who cut those flowers, the chef preparing lunch, the electrician who upgraded the wiring last month. The house is alive because people keep it alive. Every single day. And that may be the most important transformation of all. From a private mansion powered by invisible servants to a public treasure, sustained by visible professionals whose work is finally starting to be recognized as essential to the dream. Chapter 10. What survival costs? The price beyond money. This may be the most important transformation of all. From a private mansion staffed by invisible servants, to a public treasure maintained by visible professionals whose work is finally acknowledged as essential. But recognition does not erase the core tension that has always defined Biltmore, the cost of keeping something this big alive. The financial numbers are staggering. Biltmore's annual operating budget runs into the tens of millions of dollars. Payroll alone absorbs a huge share. Then come utilities. Heating and cooling roughly 4 acres of interior space, insurance for collections that cannot be replaced, and a constant stream of restoration projects that never truly end. The roof is a useful example. The original slate roof installed in the 1890s had to be completely replaced in recent decades. Slate roofing requires specialized craftsmen. The size of Biltmore's roof turned that into a multi-year, multi-million-dollar job. It was not optional. A failing roof would eventually destroy everything beneath it. But it generated no new tickets, no extra hotel bookings, no direct bump in revenue. It was pure preservation cost. That pattern repeats everywhere you look. Stone facades must be cleaned and repointed. Thousands of windows need periodic restoration. Heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems must be upgraded to modern standards. Fire suppression systems require testing, maintenance, and replacement. In a building this old and this large, every system demands attention and capital on a rolling schedule. The estate generates substantial revenue, by many estimates well over $100 million per year, but expenses are just as formidable. Biltmore operates on relatively thin margins for a business of its scale. A serious drop in attendance, a major storm, or a single unexpected high-ticket repair can push the entire operation into stress very quickly. That financial pressure shapes almost every decision. Should a closed room be opened to visitors? The question is not just, is it historically important? It is also, will the added revenue from new tour routes cover the cost of climate control, extra security, lighting, and staffing? Should the estate build more hotel rooms? The decision is weighed against construction costs, long-term maintenance, projected occupancy, and room rates. Preservation and storytelling matter, but they have to coexist with spreadsheets. This creates a constant pull between preservation and commercialization. Every new amenity, a restaurant, an event space, a retail corner, carries a risk of diluting the historical character that makes Biltmore special in the first place. But without those revenue streams, the money to care for that character dries up. The same espresso bar that feels slightly out of place may be helping pay for conservation of a tapestry upstairs. So far, the estate has mostly managed this balance. New buildings go on the periphery rather than in the middle of historic courtyards. Commercial spaces are designed to feel restrained rather than loud or flashy, but the pressure never really disappears. The temptation to just add one more thing to boost revenue has to be resisted over and over again. There is another trade-off: access versus preservation. More visitors mean more income and more damage. Every person who walks across a century-old floor, puts a hand on a carved railing, or simply breathes the slightly humid air into a fragile room contributes microscopic wear. Multiply that by hundreds of thousands of people each year, and the impact becomes very real. The estate manages this with tightly controlled access. Tour sizes are limited. The most fragile areas are closed or shown only on special tours. Routes are designed to spread out traffic, so the same surfaces are not punished day after day. Those limits protect the house, but they also cap revenue. Biltmore could, in theory, admit far more people if preservation were treated more casually. And then, there are the things you cannot put into a budget. What was lost when Biltmore stopped being a private home? George Vanderbilt's vision was not of a ticketed attraction. He imagined a retreat, a quiet place to read, walk, and host selected guests. That vision effectively died the moment economic necessity forced the family to sell tickets. The Vanderbilts gave up privacy. The small rituals of domestic life, even in a house this enormous, were replaced by the steady flow of strangers. The rooms still hold the same furniture, art, and books, but they no longer hold birthdays, arguments, sleepless nights, or private conversations. Some would say that is a fair exchange. The house survives. That is what matters. But something real disappeared in the process. The feeling of authentic use, of rooms doing the jobs they were built for. A banquet hall without true family dinners. A library without an owner reading by the fire is preserved, but it is not the same. Biltmore also forces an uncomfortable question about inequality. The estate remains privately owned, and its profits still flow to the Cecil family. It employs thousands, pumps money into the regional economy, and protects a major piece of American architectural history. At the same time, it sustains a dynastic fortune that began in the Gilded Age, an era defined by extreme wealth at the top and struggle at the bottom. Is this the right way to preserve places like Biltmore? Should estates of this scale sit in private hands, or should they become public trusts? There is no simple answer. Public ownership brings its own problems: political fights over funding, changing priorities, bureaucratic delays. Private ownership can mean strong, consistent leadership, or it can mean closed gates and eventual demolition. Both models have produced success stories and failures. What is hard to deny is that William Cecil's commercial model worked in this particular case. The house stands. It is structurally sound. It is maintained at a high standard. Millions of people have had the chance to see it with their own eyes, instead of in old photographs. None of that would have happened without a business-first approach, but the cost was permanent change. Biltmore will never again be what George Vanderbilt built it to be. It is now a company, a destination, a brand. It is a home only in the historical sense. Its daily life is defined not by one family's needs, but by ticket times, tour schedules, and event calendars. The staff who work there live inside this paradox. Their job is to make the house feel alive, while knowing that what they are curating is, to some extent, a carefully staged version of the past. Visitors feel that tension too, even if they cannot quite name it. They admire the architecture, the tapestries, the views. They imagine what it would be like to live there. but they are always on the outside. Customers, not guests. The relationship is transactional, not personal. This is what survival required. Not just money and good management, but a deep shift in the very nature of the place. The house was saved, but it was also turned into something its creator neither planned for nor likely would have recognized. Whether that trade-off was worth it depends on what you value more, the purity of the original vision or the continued existence of the physical building. Biltmore chose existence, and for now it survives. Chapter 11. The house that belongs to everyone who walks through it. Whether that trade-off was worth it depends on what you value more, the purity of the original vision or the continued existence of the building itself. Biltmore chose existence, and in doing so, it became something unexpected, a place that belongs, in a way, to everyone who experiences it. Walk through Biltmore on almost any day and you can see what that means. A retired stonemason from Pennsylvania stands in front of the facade, his hand resting lightly on the limestone. He studies the chisel marks, the way the blocks lock together, the technique used to carve the tracery and ornament. They knew what they were doing, he says quietly to his wife. This work would cost a fortune today. You can't even find craftsmen who can do this anymore. In that moment, he is connecting across a century to the men who shaped those stones, workers whose names were never recorded on any plaque, but whose skill is still visible in every clean edge and carved detail. In the library, a teenage girl who wants to study architecture cannot stop taking photographs. She zooms in on ceiling beams, built-in bookcases, the way natural light falls across the room. She does not know Richard Morris Hunt's name, but she is learning from him anyway. Years from now, elements of this room will surface in her own designs. A middle-aged couple from Atlanta walks slowly through the winter garden, holding hands. They got engaged here 20 years ago during a Christmas visit. Ever since, they have come back every few years, measuring their own lives against the unchanging glass, stone, and greenery. Biltmore has slipped into their private story. It is now one of the landmarks of their marriage. In the basement service areas, now part of the tour, a school teacher from Asheville stands with her 5th grade class. She explains how many people it took to run a house like this, what their working days looked like, how the call bell board controlled every movement. The children crowd around the panel of room names and bulbs, trying to imagine hearing a bell ring and having to drop everything to respond. She is using Biltmore to teach about labor, social class, and how society has changed. The house has become a teaching tool, a 3-dimensional textbook. Out in the gardens, an elderly woman sits alone on a bench. She worked here in the 1960s, cleaning rooms, when tourism was still new and uncertain. She has not told anyone she came today. This is a quiet pilgrimage. She looks at the same mountain line she saw from these paths 60 years ago and feels time folding over itself. Her work is not mentioned on any tour, but Biltmore holds her memories as surely as it holds George Vanderbilt's. Moments like these happen constantly, thousands of small connections flickering into existence between people and place. The house means something different to each visitor, but it almost always means something. For some, it is about craftsmanship, stone, wood, and ironwork done at a level they rarely see anywhere else. For others, it is about history, a way to understand how wealth, work, and technology looked in another era. For many, it is simply about beauty, the kind of beauty that stops you in your tracks and makes you go quiet. For the people who work here, the connection is deeper and more complicated. They spend their days in spaces most visitors see once or twice in a lifetime. They know the building in ways that never make it onto placards. Which floorboards always squeak, where the afternoon light is best in winter, how the whole structure sounds when it is completely empty at night. A housekeeper notices things no guest ever will. She sees where fabric has started to wear thin on a chair, which patch of carpet is fading, where dust gathers even after daily cleaning. She knows which paintings are beginning to show signs of strain and need a conservator's eye. Her knowledge is practical, precise, and born of repetition. A gardener understands the estate by seasons, not days. He has watched 30 springs arrive. He has seen the same dogwoods bloom 3 decades in a row. He plants trees knowing they may need 50 years to reach their full shape, trees that will shade visitors whose names he will never know. A tour guide tells the same core stories hundreds of times, but the questions people ask keep changing. Those questions push her to rethink the narrative. Less about the raw size of the house, more about Edith's stubbornness, Cornelia's choices, and the servants who kept everything running. She learns over time that visitors are drawn less to numbers and more to human dilemmas. Out of these countless individual encounters grows a kind of shared ownership, not legal ownership, that still rests with the Cecil family and the Biltmore Company, but emotional ownership. A sense that the house now belongs to the culture at large, not just to a single bloodline. This is the final transformation of George Vanderbilt's dream. He built a private refuge to escape public life. That refuge now survives only because the public wants it to survive. Because people care enough to buy tickets, stay in the hotels, drink the wine, and tell their friends to visit. In every way except the legal documents, the house has become public. There is an irony in that. Biltmore began as an extreme expression of aristocratic excess. One man's inherited fortune turned into 4 acres of rooms he did not strictly need. Today, that same excess is the foundation for something surprisingly democratic. The beauty that was once reserved for a few now belongs to many. School children from the local area, retired couples from thousands of kilometers away, architecture students with sketchbooks, history obsessives, families who just wanted one day together that would feel like it mattered. George Vanderbilt once kept his library to himself and a small circle of friends. Now hundreds of thousands of people file through each year, staring up at the ceiling, peering at the spines of his books, feeling the weight of accumulated knowledge and taste. The banquet hall once hosted formal dinners for a handful of guests. Now it hosts the imaginations of everyone who steps into it, trying to picture what it would have felt like to sit at that table, under that ceiling, surrounded by murals and tapestries. The house was built for one man's quiet retreat. It has become a place where millions of people come looking for inspiration, beauty, history, and connection, and often find more of it than they expected. In being saved, it was transformed. In being transformed, it was opened. In being opened, it shifted from private symbol to shared experience. Biltmore belongs now to everyone who walks through it, to anyone who has ever stood in its halls and felt something they could not quite put into words. And maybe after everything, that is exactly how it should be. Chapter 12. What we choose to keep Biltmore belongs now to everyone who walks through it. And that perhaps is exactly as it should be, but that leads to a larger question, one that goes far beyond a single mansion in the mountains of North Carolina. What do we choose to preserve, and why do we fight so hard to keep certain things? America has never been especially gentle with its own past. Cities tear down historic buildings to make room for parking lots and glass towers. Families give away or throw out heirlooms because they do not match a new sofa or fit in a small apartment. As a culture, we like to look forward. The weight of history often feels like something to escape, not something to carry. And yet Biltmore stands. It stands against economic logic, against practical common sense, against the same tide of time that swept away so many similar places. The mansions of Newport survived only because people intervened dramatically at the last possible moment. Many other Gilded Age estates were not so lucky. Demolished outright, their stone and timber salvaged or sold. Grand hotels that once defined an era simply vanished. Private railroad cars were cut up for scrap. Yachts that symbolized another world were broken apart and forgotten. Biltmore survived because specific people made specific choices at very specific moments. Edith could have sold the estate in 1914. She chose to fight for it instead. Cornelia could have closed the house during the Depression and walked away. She chose to open the doors to the public. William could have abandoned Biltmore in 1960 as an unsalvageable burden. He chose to mortgage nearly everything and bet on restoration. Each of those decisions demanded sacrifice. None came with guarantees. But together, they formed a chain of continuity stretching across more than a century. This is what preservation really looks like in practice. Not just grand speeches or official declarations, but countless choices made by people who decide, often quietly, often at personal cost, that something is worth saving even when the numbers say otherwise. The restoration worker who spends months repairing a single window frame. The donor who writes a check to fund conservation of a tapestry or a roof. The staff member who dusts the same surfaces day after day, slowing the march of time by a fraction of a millimeter. The visitor who buys a ticket, tells friends to come, and brings their children back years later. The family members who resist the lure of selling everything and investing in simpler, safer assets. All of them are, in their own way, choosing Biltmore. And by choosing it, they are quietly stating what they believe matters. They are saying that beauty matters, that craftsmanship matters, that history matters, even when that history is uncomfortable, unequal, or awkward to talk about, that some things are worth the ongoing cost of maintenance, even when that cost never really ends. But preservation is never neutral. We do not save everything. We pick and choose. And those choices expose our values. Biltmore has been preserved with extraordinary care. The building is in better condition now than it was 50 years ago. But it has been preserved primarily as the Vanderbilt family experienced it, not as the servants did. The grand rooms upstairs are restored and celebrated. The service corridors and workspaces downstairs are accessible, but not interpreted with the same depth or investment. That is changing, slowly. Recent years have brought more focus on workers' lives, more acknowledgement of the labor that made the luxury possible. Exhibits and tours spend more time on the people who cooked, carried, cleaned, and repaired. Still, the imbalance remains. We are quicker to save what we find beautiful, impressive, or glamorous than what we find hard, painful, or ordinary. This pattern repeats across historic sites everywhere. Plantations turn into wedding venues, while slavery is sometimes mentioned only in brief paragraphs on a sign. Industrial sites celebrate innovation and entrepreneurship while skimming over dangerous, exhausting working conditions. Historic homes lovingly restore parlors and bedrooms, but gloss over kitchens, laundries, and cramped servant quarters where the real work happened. Biltmore has done better than many. The service areas are part of the visitor experience. The labor story is present in the narrative. Yet the main lens is still the family at the top, not the workforce that stood behind them. This is not just Biltmore's problem. It is a larger question about how we preserve and present history. Whose stories do we amplify? Whose work do we celebrate? Whose names end up in the guidebook? And whose never appear at all? Even with all these limitations, imperfect preservation is still better than no preservation. Biltmore exists. People can walk through it, feel its scale, and argue about what it represents. It sparks conversations about wealth and privilege, about labor and class, about beauty, sustainability, and what it means to keep something huge alive in a world that is always changing. Without the building, most of those conversations would never happen. The estate also shows that preservation can sometimes be economically self-sustaining. For years, the widely accepted belief was that houses like Biltmore needed government funding, nonprofit status, or constant philanthropy to survive. William Cecil demonstrated another path. Here, the house pays for its own preservation through the revenue it generates: tickets, hotels, wine, food, and events, without taxpayer subsidy or charity drives. This model has clear limits. It works at Biltmore because the estate is spectacular enough to attract huge crowds. A smaller, less visually dramatic historic site cannot just copy this playbook and expect the same results. But the example widened the field of possibilities. It showed that preservation does not always have to mean financial dependence. Other estate owners and historic organizations noticed. Many have studied what Biltmore did and adapted parts of the model. Across the country, historic properties have professionalized their visitor experience, expanded amenities, and developed revenue streams strong enough to fund serious conservation work. This marks a real shift in American preservation, away from relying almost entirely on nonprofits and public funding and toward hybrid or fully commercial models. Whether you see that as progress or compromise depends on your perspective, but for many buildings, it has been the difference between survival and demolition. Stand in front of Biltmore today, looking up at that unlikely facade, and you are seeing something rare. A Gilded Age dream that made it into the 21st century largely intact, not frozen, not unchanged, but still recognizably itself, still fulfilling a version of its original purpose. George Vanderbilt wanted to create something beautiful that would last. He succeeded, but not in the way he expected. The house endures not because one man's fortune built it, but because generation after generation of people, family, staff, experts, visitors, decided to preserve it. They decided again and again that it was worth the effort, the money, and the compromise. That decision continues every single day, every time a manager signs off on a restoration project, every time a maintenance worker fixes a leak before it spreads, every time a visitor chooses to buy a ticket instead of doing something else with that money and that day, every time an employee wakes up, puts on a uniform, and goes to work inside that house. Biltmore will stand as long as people keep making that choice. There is no guarantee how long that will be. Tastes change, economies shift, priorities move on. But for now, the choice is still being made. The house endures. And in enduring, it quietly turns the question back on all of us. What, in our own lives, is worth the cost of keeping?